Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Rook Quality Systems in partnership with Safe Health. We're thrilled you could join us for this very important discussion on how decentralized clinical trials are transforming IVD and diagnostic studies. For those of you who may not be familiar, decentralized clinical trials, also known as DCTs, are changing the way studies are conducted by integrating digital tools, remote monitoring, and patient-centric approaches. Today, we'll explore what this means specifically for in vitro diagnostics and diagnostic devices and the opportunities ahead. We'll have time for the Q&A session at the end, but we encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we will address them when we get to the Q&A session. Today's session will start with Joel and Lawrence, who will define what a decentralized clinical trial is and walk us through the core elements of the DCT model, focusing on how these trials work and the benefits they bring to diagnostic research. After that, Kyle will shift the focus to the regulatory side, covering FDA expectations for IVD and diagnostic clinical studies, best practices for compliant trial documentation, and practical tips for bridging DCT approaches with FDA requirements. Now I'd like to pass it over to today's speakers to briefly introduce themselves before we dive into today's presentation.
I'm Kyle Rose, CEO and founder of Rook Quality Systems. Rook Quality is a medical device consulting firm that supports regulatory quality and clinical support for all types of devices. We work a lot with diagnostic devices, wearables, and monitoring devices, and we'll have a lot of information today for you on how to work with your DCT trial and your clinical trials.
I'll go next. Joel Kordiak. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for Safe Health Systems. It is nice to meet you all. Safe is a technology-focused business that really enables remote care experiences, and this is around diagnostic tests. And specifically, what we'll be talking about today is our decentralized clinical trial offering and how that can support studies. But it's great to meet you all and happy to be here.
Lawrence Duffin, Chief Experience Officer at Safe Health Systems. We're excited to share some of our knowledge with everybody on the call today and dive into some of the DCT offerings and regulatory components. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, so before we get into the nuts and bolts and specifics of DCTs, I think it's important that we take a step back and understand what a decentralized clinical trial platform is. To be clear, this is not a replacement of your quality teams or your regulatory or your clinical operations teams. What it is another tool to add to the toolbox. Before we jump into the specific slide here, I want to share something and let you know that if you have not heard about DCTs and specifically in context of IVD diagnostic testing, that's okay. It's not your fault. This is a new topic, and overall, this is one that is rising right now. We've seen a large upswell of this type of technology and large interventional studies, but it's relatively new in this space. And so as we go through today, I invite you to enjoy, ask questions, and treat this as a learning opportunity. When we look at DCT platforms, it's important to understand that the impetus behind it is really two things. One, it's driving better patient experiences. When we talk about the participants who are engaging, it's around today as a society, we walk different, we shop different, we drive different, we eat dinner differently, we order it out, we watch movies online instead of going to theaters, we rise and shine differently. Technology and how we use it is pervasive in our day-to-day lives. But when you look at the clinical trial industry in general, that technology has not stayed up to stayed up to speed. And there's very good reasons for that. Chiefly among that is related to patient safety. So when we look at patient safety, going back to the Tuskegee experiments in 1972, when IRBs were created, there was really a focus on patient safety. One of the things that I really like and to think about is when we look at DCTs is to understand Moravec's paradox. Moravec's paradox was created by a researcher named Hans Moravec in the 1980s, focusing on AI, but in general, it speaks to computers excel at tasks that humans don't, and vice versa. Humans excel at tasks that computers don't. And the goal when we look at these DCTs is to understand how we can use technology to blend with our operations teams to be more effective. One of the key things as we go back to the advent of the IRBs and then study design in general is there's a lot of processes and procedures for ensuring quality in clinical study outcomes, as well as ensuring quality and safety for patients. That has been traditionally designed as, I like to think of it as a three-ring binder of procedures and policies. As we go through, we're audited on those policies, driving forward. As we go through that, if there's an issue in the past, we add a new procedure that a human can follow to be able to ensure that they cut off that risk and they mitigate that going forward. The problem with that paradigm is it tends to be a retrospective review of risk and more about how do we block something that happened in the past as opposed to shaping the right behaviors to make sure that we are getting the successful outcomes that we want. As a result, we have this very risk-averse, slowly evolving process, which frankly, when in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, that technology didn't exist to be able to use and streamline studies. So we were trying to get people to act more like machines. How do we methodically collect the data from patients? How do we transcribe that? How do we source data, verify those nuances? And in doing that, we have a very procedure-driven outcome. The goal of DCTs is to take chunks out of that binder and replace it with the right tools to be able to mitigate those risks going forward. So as we are talking today, we're going to talk about some of the capabilities, the benefits, and how that applies. But keep in mind, this isn't about changing the outcomes of a study. This isn't about changing overall goals and objectives. And a lot of times, it doesn't have to change even the study design. What it is about using technology intelligently to do the things that people generally aren't good at, and using people to augment and do the things that technology is good at. And when you have the two working together, then we have a successful outcome. So some of the capabilities that we're going to talk about today at a high level within a DCT platform are, first at the top, HIPAA compliant, GDPR compliant, 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. These are all regulatory driven frameworks to be able to ensure that we are protecting data, we are protecting the integrity of study information, patient information, to be able to ensure we have the right outcomes. This is a critical point. And until, frankly, in 2013, there was the first studies that were driven, and there's some white papers we can share. I had the benefit or the fortune to be part of those discussions. As we got into those first studies, the technology just started to evolve recently over the last 10 years, 15 years to be able to do this well. And so as we're going through that, the technology is a big part of making sure that we can check the box on some of these requirements to be able to facilitate the study design. So some key features, consent and AI, we'll talk about that in just a minute here. But that's about how do we make sure that we are recognizing and verifying that a person is who they say they are, as well as a person is taking the participation of the study based off of that recognition. Testing, test kit shipping, configurable questionnaires, driving e-source for a lot of the study design, so we mitigate transcription errors or loss of files on sites and CRA work that has to happen. Doing televisits and proctoring, it's a big part of being able to facilitate completion of studies in their intended environment at home in a remote context. Integration with recruitment partners, with logistics, even with EDCs, IRTs, a variety of clinical systems that help facilitate overall design, and then translations and then reports. I mean, these are all components that we can talk about. And the reason we bring this slide up is not to go into the nuance of every single piece, but to really understand that there's a wide variety of tools in the toolbox. And as we're looking at specific studies, we can utilize the right piece of information, the right tools to meet the right study design. So a couple of things we want to dive into is, one is AI consent. This is an important understanding to have around DCT platforms in general. The key thing here is we are, one, validating and verifying that a person is who they say they are. And that's critical from a remote context. What we can't do is just invite somebody into the system and assume that they're a good actor, that they are have a good intent, that they're doing this all for the right reasons. What we have to do is verify that that person is exactly who they say they are. And so if I'm Joel Kordiak, I have my ID here. We can verify with 99.9% accuracy that a person is who they say they are off of their valid ID, off of an AI-driven facial recognition, and get that quality. It's a slightly different approach where we actually expect that we're going to, as we recruit into these studies, we're going to have a higher dropout rate. And that's because we are filtering out people who aren't qualified and focusing on getting in the right people who are going to drive that success. So that's a bit of a different change, and we'll talk about that more as we look at study design in general, but AI consent is a big component of that. Next, we go into features for collecting the data for the study. And we have an iPro feature where we can collect questionnaires. This is both for the participant and for the clinician side, all directly into the system as eSource, specifically with the iPro functionality. Something like this is great because we can do a site-based study where a patient never has to log into the system. They can have 100% accuracy collection of data, guarantee it's in the right profile and connectivity to their test results without ever having to log into the system. These types of tools are critical when we're designing studies overall, and it allows this technology to help streamline and ease the burden for patients to participate. So if you're in a remote context or an on-site context, there's a mixture of the right tools that we can use to facilitate different study designs. And this is the exciting thing is, again, it's not about doing a cookie cutter template. Every protocol is unique. These tools allow us to adjust and modify the use of these capabilities for the study design.
When designing the studies, there's a couple main levers we can pull for participant recruitment. First of all is the DCT platform. That one utilizes social media and other digital engagement methods. There's millions of people on social media nationwide, right? So it gives us the ability to have outreach and strategies that go way beyond the traditional brick and mortar site. However, there's also challenges with that, right? Meaning that we're going to have a huge funnel of people that are willing to participate in the clinical study, but we have to have really good inclusion-exclusion criteria and ways to ensure that the participants are high quality. Couple ways to do that. What we do is obviously go out and do these nationwide campaigns in the hot spots in the regions where, let's say, there's upper respiratory flares in California and Florida. We'll target those regions. Then they go through, they fill out the forms online, and then immediately they trigger a trained clinician to pick up the phone and call those participants. And they vet them. They go through, they make sure that they are going to pass, they're high quality. And those are the types of methods that Joel was mentioning where we blend technology, social media, AI with the human touch, the white glove factor to make sure that we're bringing in those quality participants. The other side of it is, well, we're still going to be able to use in a hybrid model the brick and mortar recruitment strategy, using urgent care to get the moms that bring in their young children, the age demographics that are hard to reach. Using a blend of those technologies, we're able to collect data that's very high quality and shorten the study timelines and reduce costs and a bunch of other benefits that we'll jump into here on subsequent slides. I'll touch a little bit more on the retention component of it. I think that's one where people are concerned. How are you guys able to make sure that the participants are going to go all the way through to the end and complete the study? And again, the answer is it's a blend. It's a blend of using technology, trained clinicians to outreach to the participants to get them enrolled. And then immediately we have follow-up phone calls to schedule their proctor session with the trained proctors and all the way through the completion of the study. So it's a hybrid approach, right? And it's very successful. We have a high rate of retention, and most of the studies we run is 95+%, which is arguably higher than a lot of the brick and mortar engagements. So we're excited to share more knowledge with you. Shipping. How do we ensure that the participants are getting the materials, getting the box, and going through the study design? So as an example, as soon as somebody is recruited into the clinical study, they go through the consent process. When the PI signs their consent, there's an automatic notification that gets sent to the third-party logistics company. There is where the kitting has already been done and completed. We will then label it, ship it overnight to the participants, and then they go ahead and receive the box the following day with their pre-scheduled proctor session. At that point, they go through their video proctor. We make sure that the participant ID matches the sample that's being recorded via labels and AI pictures and of the test itself, pictures of the participant ID. And we have a bunch of logs and data points that we can correlate to ensure that everything lines up. And then the participant is proctored and they visually watch them package up the samples and do it correctly and put it in the fridge until the UPS pickup or FedEx pickup driver shows up to their home, picks up the box, and then mails it back to the lab for processing. So the whole thing is obviously monitored, and we use the technology to help us speed up, reach people that typically will not participate in a clinical study, but then ensure the logistics and the samples and the data collection and the protocol is adhered to.
The capabilities we just talked through, again, these are tools in the toolbox. And as you think about implementing this technology into your broader study designs, the value is understanding what are the outcomes you're trying to get, the timing you need to reach patients, what is the context you need to reach them. Understanding that context with your clinical teams is what's going to make this implementation of this type of platform most effective. And for Lawrence and myself and the broader team here, we've had the fortune of being involved in a large number of these technology implementations. And because of that experience, we've seen a lot of what works and doesn't work and can help identify some of the risk gaps. And so as you have questions, if there's any of those concerns that come up, please bring those into the chat. We would love to address any of those concerns that you might have from a technology standpoint, because that is important to get out of this overall discussion.
So we talked a little bit about increased patient access, right? Everybody's on social media, well, 75% of the US population anyway, and allows us to have those agile recruitment strategies and hotspots and regions that are typically really hard to reach. And it gives us agility to be able to shut down in a particular region and ramp up in another one to capture high quality participants for the clinicals. Improved enrollment, it's an obvious factor. We were able to reach more people, we're able to get higher numbers, and then of course we ensure that they're high quality. And then retention rates are maximized by coupling up the technology, what it does really well, being able to get people to engage and so forth with trained professionals, clinicians, to make sure that we take them all the way through the beginning and the end of the study. And it's the white glove treatment. We'll have outreach phone calls, video sessions, whatever they need to be supported to have a successful outcome. I think one of the most important factors is the real-time data collection. By using the Decentralized Clinical Trial platform, nationwide coverage, everybody is entering and capturing that information real time, right? They're capturing their symptoms, they're capturing their patient forms, the proctors filling out their clinician forms. And then of course, we're able to receive the data and the outcomes of the tests. Are there discordant results? Are there certain elements that we really need to monitor real time? And the answer is yes, absolutely. By having a site or real-time monitoring, you're able to control recruitment, right? We can slow down recruitment, we can speed up recruitment, we can mitigate risks, we can make slight adjustments. And really the goal is to have the highest quality participant outcome for your clinical study and the data, but as well as controlling the costs, right? Doing whatever we can to ensure that we're not going over budget on certain elements, and using technology is a way to do that. Another big benefit is the time to launch the study. Typically for upper respiratory clinical trials, we're able to have the whole platform configured, verified, launched, everybody's ready to go within a 4 to 6 week time frame. That's very fast when you look at traditional. Why is it so much faster? Well, for the Decentralized Clinical Trial platform, we have one virtual site that can recruit paid participants nationwide. That's a lot less site training, that's a lot less manpower that has to go into ramping up the clinical studies. And as well as we're able to leverage certain best practices and protocols that we've had where the system is 70% ready to go, but we have to make those little tweaks that make it special, specific for your protocol. Another one is we're able to pause and restart clinical studies. I mean, there are certain instances where things, such say positivity and prevalence of an upper respiratory disease is just not high enough to hit the targets that we need. Well, we'll hit pause. We can pause it for a week, 2 weeks, months, and then immediately turn it back on again, which is another very agile process and ability that I think it's a benefit over a lot of the traditional models. So Joel, is there anything else you'd like to pepper in on benefits of DCT?
Yeah, I think you mentioned the central site. That really is a benefit from the monitoring standpoint, as Lawrence was highlighting. When we talk about the study design in general, no two protocols are ever exactly alike. There's always some slight nuance, and that's typically going to be a factor of the sponsor's risk, the risk tolerance that they're willing to take, the CRO who's utilizing the system and their procedures and policies, the site network or the recruitment strategies, all can slightly vary. the value of this is that we can adjust that to be much more specific. It also means we have much more flexibility for how we run studies. For example, there's some studies which require at-home blood draws. We have partners that have that can ship a temperature-controlled cube to a patient's house to meet a phlebotomist to collect those blood draws and ship those back to a lab, all in a temperature-controlled next day context. We have the ability to flex if it's in we need different regions or we're trying to meet different patient population needs for stratification. We can adjust those things. These are all levers that we want to be able to push and pull, and it's really driven by how we implement the technology, even to the point of if we realize that there's a protocol design change where we need to adjust the inclusion criteria. After doing an IRB approval, we can update those things in near real time with all the validation documentation needed to verify that we're not impacting existing study data. So lots of flexibility. The goal here is to say it's not only one right way to do this. The goal is to say we have multiple tools to be able to influence and affect the study in the way it's needed while maintaining the quality and the best use case possible.
So before you go on, I want you to just add in a little more color on the DCT platform, the way that the data is collected real time versus kind of the traditional aspect of using an EDC and going from paper into that particular nature, and how this helps mitigate that risk. And then we'll hit the next slide.
Yeah, from a risk standpoint, one of the biggest issues we have in studies is collecting patient information. Do you do that on paper? Are you doing it on site? Do you have different sites with different clinical staff who are maybe doing things slightly different about how they collect that data, how they organize it, store it? The value of this platform is when we set up the CRFs or ClinRows or whatever, if there's a validated requirement that we need, we can collect that data in real time. And when we do that, that helps drive the understanding and the use case of the data that's being utilized. And so that's data that we're collecting for example, in a 510K type study, we'll do our usability study. We're tracking the patient's information, the patient ID, associating it with that collected data. As we get the test results, we associate that ID with the test results at the lab, so it all triangulates. You can see a clear audit trail and traceability, and every step in the platform is auditable and able to report it on. So we can see very clearly where things fall out and where issues happen, so we can go mitigate those quickly. Oftentimes we can do that faster than a typical personnel-based processes can. So that's one of the benefits. It's that visibility gives us a two benefits, not only the real-time visibility into how we're collecting the data, how it's performing, but also it gives us the clear audit trail to be able to justify in an audit with FDA. This is exactly what happened. This is where the data came from, and we can see that in real time.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And one thing I wanted to talk on as well, Joel, is just the organization, right? Like when you're working with a traditional CRO, a lot of this is in separate forms. It's in a Dropbox, Google Drive, or spreadsheet, and just having the DCT platform really allows you to find that information quickly. It's well organized. It's all electronic. So that's, I think, a huge advantage that we've seen as well, working with you guys on the Safe Health platform, but as well compared to working on traditional studies as well. So yeah, I think that's one of the big things we've seen as well, in addition to all these things both Joel and Lawrence mentioned as well. We do want to talk a little bit on some of the high level background of when to know if you need a study, what types of devices need studies, diagnostics versus traditional medical devices, all that scope, just to give a big, broader framework to some of the audience that might not be experienced with going through studies or might have a device or diagnostic they're working on that's getting ready for their first study, right? So really wanted to provide some high level overview of kind of the regulatory and quality aspects of this, but also into a study, what information you need to maintain, what the requirements are from the FDA, and how, partnering with a decentralized trial, and working with Safe Health kind of helps streamline and make this process more efficient as well as maintaining compliance as well. Within the scope of general devices and diagnostics, so medical devices are a big umbrella that cover a lot of things. Diagnostics are considered medical devices within the scope of the FDA, and they fall in their own special criteria section as well. In general, devices are intended for diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, prevention of disease, depending on the function of and how they're used. And then devices are more specific into the diagnosis and determination. So a little overlap. The high-level regulations, as far as the quality system regulations, the regulatory paths, have a lot of overlap between medical devices and diagnostics. I think one of the things that really factors into the scope of doing clinical trials is that the majority of diagnostics, you're going to be involved with doing some sort of test that needs to be tested on a human subject, right? So within the scope of FDA, we're working on humans. So to prove that your device functions and works like it should, it's very likely that you'll need to do some sort of clinical study to show that your device is safe, effective, accurate, all of these things. And within that scope, it's very likely that you'll need a clinical study. Not all medical devices need clinical studies. Some do, some don't. It really depends on the type of device. So this, I think, webinar a little bit more focused on diagnostic scope within medical devices, but there are other types of devices that can be used with decentralized trial, things like monitoring devices, wearable devices, things like that are also kind of bridging into that scope of the at-home, over-the-counter market, are also a good fit for this type of study as well. Within the scope of specific IVD products, things like your COVID test, your pregnancy test, all of these things are common things, especially with a COVID test. We've got much more accustomed to using in our day-to-day life. Those can be different form factors. So that can be a little, paper strip or LFA device. It can also be devices that have an instrument and a cartridge that you insert after. Some devices also have software or a telehealth component. All those things can be captured within the scope of the decentralized trial model as well. Other things within the scope of the diagnostics will be, different reagents, instruments, things like that can also be within the scope of the IVD umbrella as well. Joel, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I wanted to add that you might have a question right now of, well, how do I know which device or which type of use case I should use this platform for? And really, the goal of this is to look for areas where we can streamline and maybe make more efficient to get to the end outcomes we want more successfully. There are some considerations. The platform, there's a baseline cost to set up a platform like this. And so generally speaking, you want to have the right number of patient populations. And when you get to scale, it actually lowers the cost significantly. The other aspect is, what are the type of activities that a patient needs to do, the interactions around those study designs, what is the intended use environment. Those are all things that we can look at and help kind of give suggestions for how to drive the study, overall study design and protocol. And in doing that, you'll get a range and see the value and the benefit, and it becomes at the end of the day, it's going to become a very straightforward, does it add value and streamline, or doesn't it? And it's not right for every use case, but there's a lot of value when we look at how we can streamline and simplify some existing processes.
Awesome. All right. So now on to just some of the high-level regulatory stuff. So some people might be familiar. A lot of the work Rook does is helping new products, new devices, new diagnostics identify kind of what their regulatory path is, as well as if they need a clinical trial. Within the scope of FDA regulations, there's 3 different classes. So class 1, traditionally not a ton of review by the FDA before you're able to sell. And traditionally, those products typically don't have the requirement for a clinical trial. Where we do see a lot of clients that need clinical trials would be in this class 2 and 510(k) pre-market notification. So these are devices that have a clear pathway and a medium risk profile, and you can identify a predicate to work from. Things like diagnostic devices, wearable monitoring devices, a lot of these fall into that class 2 bucket, and a lot of them would require a clinical trial as well. There are some exceptions. There are some class 1 devices. We've actually seen this with diagnostic devices that are providing a result at home. There are certain exemptions from the FDA regulations saying if you are doing an at-home diagnostic, even though it's a class 1 and potentially 510(k) exempt, once you add that at-home functionality to it, then you are required to submit a 510(k). So paying attention, even if it's a low-risk product, you might have to do a submission with a class 1 and likely a clinical trial. Kind of next level of classification, still within class 2, but would be a de novo classification. So these are devices or diagnostics that do not have a predicate device, have a new technology or new functionality that you're preparing to submit to the FDA. So this classification requires additional communication and negotiation with the FDA to identify what testing is required, what clinical trial might be required, what the endpoints are, and then you'll complete that and work through your submission. The next level up and highest risk within the scope of the FDA would be a class 3 device. These require a pre-market application. These are typically more higher risk profile, so permanent implantable devices, things like that that are more complex. So these have typically a requirement for a clinical trial. I would say most, if not all, of class 3 PMA devices require a clinical trial, as well as additional data in your submission and likely an audit of your manufacturing. So this is something that Rook helps companies with, is determine their regulatory pathway, determine what testing is needed, and also identify if there's a need for a clinical study. Within the scope of clinical studies, there is the potential investigational device exemption, or IDE. This is a submission also to the FDA, but more in a pre-market scope to determine if your device can be used in a clinical trial. So in some cases, if you're designing a device and you have not gotten FDA clearance, but you want to start a clinical trial, you need to submit to the FDA first to see if that device is safe for clinical trial use. So this is prior to getting to a 510(k) or PMA. This is first just getting the FDA's buy-in that the device that you've designed is safe to be tested on humans within the scope of a clinical trial. There's a guidance from the FDA that outlines what types of devices would need an IDE and what would not, really based on risk profile. So within this IDE submission, you'll outline all the risks, relevant information around literature, searches and publications, things like that to the FDA, and they'll help determine whether or not you are able to start the clinical trial, if you might need more testing, or you can also use the guidance to say that based on our review, we don't need to submit an IDE. Our device is a lower risk profile, and we can start a clinical trial prior to without having to do an IDE. You'll still need an IRB review before you can do a clinical trial, but this IDE also involves the FDA. So one thing to consider, especially for the higher risk products, on whether or not you need an IDE. There's also additional standards you want to comply with as far as the good clinical practices, informed consent, and your financial disclosure work as well. Within the scope of good clinical practice, so these are the laws and regulations designed to ensure that the clinical data is safe, effective, and there's integrity within the scope of collecting clinical data and running clinical trials. Key aspects of this are listed here. So we have informed consent. This is that people know they're working in a clinical trial and that there is some risk with the product or diagnostic they're working on. IRB, that is that investigational review board, showing that they think your device is safe for this clinical trial review. So this is actually an activity that you'll submit information and walk through that process of reviewing and getting approval for an IRB and for your study. They'll also review ongoing changes to your protocols, things like that. This is something that Safe Health works with and also helps you streamline the process because you have one central IRB rather than multi-sites and potentially multiple IRBs. IRBs can be slow sometimes. Sometimes they meet once per month, sometimes they take vacation, things like that. So having an IRB that you can work with that's also efficient and can get you through can really help speed up your process. One thing that wasn't clearly defined here that we do want to cover is that as you're getting ready for your trial, you'll have to develop a specific protocol. So the protocol will say, who can use the device, how it's going to be used, what the endpoints are, what you're trying to identify. If you're comparing your device to another device that's already been cleared by the FDA, you need to specify all that information in your protocol. The protocol has to be signed off and reviewed internally, and then also reviewed by the IRB. If you make changes to the protocol during your submission, your clinical trial, you also will need to go back and potentially get updates and additional approval from the IRB as well.
One thing I'd like to add, and what you just mentioned there, is a big part of implementing the platform is having the support for how that fits into the design of your study, as Kyle was just talking about. Our team has done large amounts of study. I think me personally, I've done roughly 60 or so, utilizing this type of technology over the course of the last 10 years predating SAFE. We've seen almost everything that can happen. And the goal here is to say protocols, studies are going to have issues, risks, things that pop up. That's part of the process. The goal is to be able to identify those and work collaboratively to address those quickly. And the better we can assess those risks up front, we can plan for them, the better off and the smoother the study will run. So that partnership between the platform and the quality and regulatory and operations teams is all very strong and important. And that all leads directly into the protocols, IRB reviews, everything that Kyle is mentioning right now.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing that's critical for this scope of using a decentralized trial, or if you're using an EDC platform or some sort of electronic signature and storage, is you need to comply with the FDA regulations for electronic records, electronic signatures. So that's all outlined in 21 CFR Part 11. The Safe Health platform already meets those requirements, but if you are looking to kind of work with another CRO, make sure that they have that requirement in place as well. That is critical. This information can be audited by the FDA. Obviously, it's going through a review, but the FDA can also audit your clinical trial as well. So critical to make sure you have all this framework in place. IRB oversights and DCTs, I think we touched on this a little bit in the previous slide, but if you are doing a study with human subjects, you must submit and get IRB approval prior to the study starting. So this is critical. Make sure you have an IRB that you can work with, but also that you plan this in your timeline as far as starting your trial. Additional kind of aspects that will be covered is whether or not healthcare providers will be used in the trial, how you're going to handle and manage any complaints or adverse events relative to the study, which activities will occur where, right? So speaking of decentralized trials, we're able to evaluate at-home devices in their natural environment. So people using them at home, using a computer screen and a Zoom call, you're able to evaluate people using the at-home device in their at-home environment, which is critical, but it also needs to be clarified within the scope of your protocol and discussions with the IRB, how all that is going to go on, how the proctors are going to be involved, and everything else. And then who will have access to the patient health information. So that's critical as well. There's a lot of requirements and regulations around patient health information, how that should be stored, what information should be de-identified during a study. So making sure that you've aligned that with your plan as well.
Yeah, there's a critical highlight here that Kyle touched on that I think is important. An IRB is not going to verify the technology itself. They're not going to ensure that the DCT platform is compliant with these regulations. What they're going to do is assess how the technology is being utilized to run the study and ensure patient safety in that context. So as you're getting into discussing these topics with your operations teams, with your CROs, partners, it's important to understand that you want to verify both sides, that the technology is compliant with these regulations, and then the support to make sure that it's going to meet the patient safety needs from the IRB oversight standpoint.
Yeah, and just another point on IRB. So these are typically, like I said, a board. So it's a group of people that have varying experience, both doctors and clinicians, quality and regulatory people on the device side, and other people within the scope of this clinical trial that are reviewing and confirming that you can start a trial and you can do human studies. So it is important to account for that when you're getting ready, that the IRB board is a collection of people that'll be reviewing and experts in this space as well. Expectations on data integrity. So, like Joe was just saying, all this must be documented. The FDA and IRB can review all this information. So it's critical that the accuracy and reliability of your data is met, and one of the main focuses of both the study and the systems you're using during this. So there is back-end validation required. There was a question that came on earlier whether or not this product is a SAMD device or a software tool. It falls more in the software tool. It's not specifically a software as a medical device, but it does meet, the requirements of ISO and 21 CFR and FDA regulations for electronic data, electronic storage, electronic signatures, all of these things. So these things must be not only captured, documented, but also validated that they meet the regulations and the requirements. Audit trails is another key aspect of that you can go back and check what data was stored, but also if data was changed, who changed it, what was changed, all of that. So all that information has to be stored and maintained with any of these types of tools as well. All of this also must be stored. I think that's kind of the last point, is all these original records must be maintained. If you are doing more of a traditional site paper-based study, there's a greater risk of losing information, not being able to find that as easily, or having stuff that was not compliant with the intent of the study, whether that's a person recording it, a loss of data, whatever it might be. Much lower risk with an all full electronic documentation process. Ongoing things is the data secure and privacy, right? So this solution is designed specifically to comply with HIPAA and requirements around PHI. Using tools that are not designed for that adds additional risk to your compliance and to your study. Also, secure data transmission and storage. One of the things that we've seen working with the Safe Health team is, really being able to see things in near real time is critical. A lot of times with a study, you're getting updates, every few weeks and just seeing how things are going after stuff's already been completed, but utilizing Safe Health and the DCT platform, able to see data much closer to real time and react to that accordingly. Any handling of missing or abnormal data. So this is also something that should be defined in your protocol. If there are deviations, if there are issues that happen, how do you identify that, as well as how do you document that properly? So within the scope of FDA and clinical trials regulations, you need to document anything that happened that was a deviation from your protocol, how you handle that, and kind of what the next steps are with that process. Safety and monitoring. So key requirements of the DCT safety and monitoring plan. So make sure you have a tailored safety plan. So accounting for trial design, any adverse events or issues that could come up, how you report those, who investigates them, all of these things. There are FDA requirements for this as well. Likely your medical device diagnostic developer also has requirements for handling complaints and adverse events. So you want to make sure that all these are met and confirmed when you're starting the study. A lot of these, like we're talking about, diagnostics or lower risk devices, it's unlikely that you have an adverse event, which is a severe injury or death, but it could happen, right? So you have to have procedures in place to do this, at least to document it. It's a lot of times likely that it happened unrelated to the clinical trial, but you still need to have the framework in place to report and investigate any adverse events as well. Safety and monitoring of DCTs, so making sure that you have plans on how data will be collected, monitored, and things like that. The communication access as far as who's involved, managing your risks throughout the process, and then in some cases also using local facilities. I know there are some options for kind of a hybrid, so you can do some of the trial remotely, also have options for utilizing local labs, urgent care facilities, things like that, to also get some results that closer to real time. So having a hybrid approach where you can do both at home and in clinic monitoring is also an option for DCT platform as well. Reporting pathways. So this is kind of a great graphic that explains all of the documentation and who's involved and what their requirements are for documenting and reporting things that happen throughout the trial. So trial participants, this is the actual person going through using the device and part of the scope of the clinical trial. So they have to clearly, follow the instructions, contact the trial personnel, and report any symptoms, adverse events, or things that happen with the use of the device. In the scope of a usability study, also just kind of their preference feedback, how easy it was to use, things like that. The local healthcare provider helps review trial-related activities. If there's some sort of image analysis or interpretation of results, they're also supporting that scope as well. And then there's investigator and trial personnel. So these are the people more from like the Rook and the Safe Health side that are reviewing the data, making sure things are going properly, all the correct tests are being used, correct versions of software, things like that as you're getting through the trial. And then you have the sponsor. This is typically, the client that has the device that needs to get regulatory clearance, and they're the ones that are providing their device, making sure everything is going as planned within the scope. And then there's regulatory oversight, right? So this is high level the FDA, more local the IRB, as well as any other review, whether that's international or other people involved within the scope of the regulatory review. Some of the key documentation, we've highlighted a lot of this as we've gone through, but your clinical protocol, this is very critical to make sure you identify what you're doing, how it's going to be run. A lot of times you might want to review this clinical protocol with the FDA to make sure you're getting the correct number of subjects, collect endpoints, collecting the right data, all of that. You have your investigator brochure and your informed consent, your case report forms, monitoring plans and safety reporting, and then your final clinical study report. This clinical study report will pull together all this information, all the demographics, the results of the study. So having a decentralized electronic platform that has all this makes that study report generation, data analysis much easier when you get to that point as well. The trial documentation should also include, well-defined links between the protocols, user manuals, labeling, risk analysis, all of these things. So make sure all of this is tracked within the scope of the trial and your quality system during the actual running of the clinical trial. Some clinical trials can go, a few months, some can take, multiple years, right? So making sure you're tracking all this information and records as you go is critical for the success, because as you know, this will be reviewed by the FDA and they can ask questions of anything that happened with any subject throughout the whole time. So you want to make sure you have all of this information and documentation stored and easily accessible. Make sure, again, electronic informed consent, so IRB approval, and then completing these is one of the other ways that this process can be more efficient. Remote data collection as well, so real-time data, being able to review this, discuss, make any tweaks to the trial, any pauses, any location changes if you're looking for some sort of infectious disease, being able to target different areas is also critical, or a certain demographic as well in your study. Maintaining protocol compliance. So this is also part of the DCT platform that helps maintain compliance throughout the study. So being able to review the protocol, how it's being implemented, and any areas that might have issues that you can then tweak or update throughout the trial, pending IRB review. And then ongoing audit compliance. So making sure you have all this ready. Like I said, the FDA can audit your study, so making sure you have this all in place as well. Some of the best practices to align with DCTs. So making sure that you realize that FDA applies the same regulatory expectations to decentralized trials as site-based trials. So you need to have all the corresponding documentation, training of your CRAs, your proctors, all of those need to be trained and documented. Making sure that you have the data reliability and participant safety and protocol compliance is critical for any clinical trial. A bridging strategy to make sure if there are big questions that need to be answered related to doing this study at home versus a traditional site, how you can answer those questions and whether or not you need to review that with the FDA ahead of time. Pre-submission meetings are great for confirming the scope of your protocol, confirming any questions you might have as you're preparing for a decentralized trial to make sure the FDA buys into that. You don't want to spend a lot of time and money to do a full study and then the FDA not agree with your plan. So make sure that you have some buy-in from the FDA going into your study. And then alignment with the instructions and process, both for the trial facing, so the user manuals and labeling, as well as for the people that are managing the clinical trial, DCT trial as well. Submission ready best practices. So once you've completed your study, you're getting ready to submit this to the FDA, make sure you have all of the correct information. You have the back-end validation electronic records for the study. You've integrated, study-specific artifacts into your submission packages that apply as well. You have clear traceability through all your documentation. You've completed the usability requirements for your device. If it is an at-home device, you're going to have to do a usability study. So make sure you have all that, and that's planned in your trial as well. And then considerations for test performance. So just making sure that you have done some pre-testing. You can also do, pre-field study or clinical trial to evaluate your device in a real-world use. And then making sure you have ongoing review of the lots that are used, any kind of variables related to transport, things like that, throughout the study as well to make sure it's performing as planned. So that's a high-level overview of, both the DCT trial, the advantages, as well as the regulatory requirements. We will open it up for questions now. I know we had a few come in before the presentation, so wanted to pass it back over to, I think, Jacqueline, as she's going to be asking the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle, Joel, and Lawrence for such an insightful presentation. Just for the sake of time, like Kyle said, I'm just going to jump right into some of the questions we've received. So one being, what types of devices do you think are the best fit for leveraging the DCT model?
I think DCT in a decentralized context clearly lends itself to any sort of remote device where you would utilize from home or in a remote context. It can also be very beneficial in more traditional site-based models when we look at efficiency and streamlining of data collection, though the greatest value you're going to receive in that remote context in an OTC type experience.
Yeah, and I think that's, just something we see a lot is a lot of these, at-home diagnostics, ongoing monitoring, wearables, things like that, remote patient monitoring. Those are huge areas of growth in the medical device scope. So I think that really ties it to this type of trial. If you are developing a product like this, it's a really good fit for any of those at-home, over-the-counter products as well.
Another question we received is, for home use IVDs, does the FDA expect test results to be confirmed by both AI-based digital readers and manual review?
I think it's important to separate and distinguish between AI-based readers versus the DCT platform. We do use some AI components, but generally, if those are mixed, it can create some confusion. So in an AI-based reader, you're typically going to need a separate study to validate that reader is running the test correctly. There is no universally cleared AI reader for clinical studies at this point. And so when we're looking at the DCT side, it's more about the operations of the study, not necessarily the test read itself. And we have experience with helping test manufacturers take their process or their tests through getting a digital read of their test using an AI reader, and that would be a separate study altogether. So generally speaking, maybe to answer the questions specifically, when we're doing this design, it's going to be a self-read using the IFU that is, or the quick reference guide that's associated to the test. If there is a specific desire to do a digital read, an AI interpretation read, that is a specific study design that we can facilitate as well. We have the capabilities to do that and have done that. It's just not necessarily a requirement to use this DCT platform.
So another question that was asked says, how do we make a reasonable and acceptable proposal to the FDA to perform the count which supports a 510(k) submission outside of the US? For example, Instead of 75 people in the US, we do 40 people in the Netherlands and 40 people in Mexico for the trial.
Yeah, I can take that one from the technology standpoint, and then Kyle, let you speak to the more of the operation side. From the technology standpoint, the system is set up to run both in the US and ex-US, and that covers all the requirements from the platform is high trust certified, HIPAA compliant, ISO compliant, as well as GDPR compliant. The data can be collected. The platform is easily translated into different languages for patient participation. So from a logistics standpoint of deploying the technology, that's fairly straightforward. It just comes down to your protocol design, having run these types of solutions in 10,000 patient use cases across Europe and South America, pretty much seeing everything that you can see, and the technology is there. That really comes down to an operational use case, considering the patient population needs in those different countries could vary.
Yeah, and I think within the scope of, the high level regulatory compliance, the FDA is reviewing devices to be sold in the US, right? So if you're doing a clinical trial, you need to show that the demographics of the trial meet the high level demographics of the United States, right? So if you're doing a trial in two different countries, you just need to show how that population is also representative of the US population, right? And so that's something to take into consideration, whether or not that's doing a pre-submission meeting or something like that to say, hey, we want to do part of the study here, but we also want to do part international in getting them to buy in on that. But there are some ways you can propose that to the FDA, depending on the device as well, right? So it also depends on what the device is and who's going to be using it. So there's a few variables, but I would say highly recommend, working with a consultant and then also having some sort of pre-submission meeting reviewing this protocol with the FDA as well.
Well, I think that's all that we have time for today. So thank you all for your thoughtful questions and for joining us today. And a big thank you to our presenters from Rook Quality Systems and Safe Health for sharing their expertise with us today. We hope you all found that this session was valuable and it gave you a new perspective on decentralized clinical trials. If you'd like to continue the conversation or learn more about how Rook Quality Systems or Safe Health can support your clinical trial and regulatory needs, please don't hesitate to reach out. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Hope you all have a great day.